Hi, welcome to this week's Office Hours. My name's Alan Kent. I'm from Google. I'm a developer advocate here at Google. Today we've got hopefully going to be an interesting conversation on progressive web apps. But just a little bit of housekeeping things before we jump into the main interview. So first, if you want to get notifications of future episodes, don't forget you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. We create an event before the actual event starts up, so feel free to subscribe. Also a radical one. If you're finding this content useful, it'd be really helpful for us if you hit the like button. And by that, I don't mean like to try and get the ratings up, but if you just hit the like button to actually indicate you find an episode is useful, that gives us a bit of feedback to sort of work out what topics are most useful, because frankly, we're doing these calls for you, the audience, and so if you're finding it useful, great, we'll do more of them. But just if you hit the like button for the episodes you like in particular, and we actually use the like button for a like button, that would be great. So one little bit of news that I thought was interesting was a blog came out during the week on, it was actually from the AMP project, but it was on cumulative layout shift. And it just talked about the impact of cumulative layout shift and how to evaluate it and some metrics for measuring it. And so even if you're not interested in the AMP part of it, there is a cumulative layout shift. And we'll drop a link into the chat session a little bit. But it's just cumulative layout shift is one of those painful things that when you're on a page and the page jumps around a bit, it's not really a very good user experience. And there are some techniques there talking about how they measured it and so forth. But what I'd like to do now is jump over to the main interview. And we've got PJ McLaughlin here from Google. And I'll get you, maybe PJ, wrong button, helps if I click the right button, sorry about that. So PJ, rather than me munging up an introduction to yourself, do you want to give yourself a short introduction to yourself?
Of course, thanks Alan. I'm PJ, I'm a product manager on the Chrome web platform team, and I'm responsible for progressive web apps and Chrome permissions. Cool.
Well, maybe if we could just start off with a little bit of clarity around terminology, because there's web apps, there's PWA, there's SPA, there's MPA, there's React, Vue, like 50,000 frameworks. Could you just give a bit of an overview just to sort of describe and sort of put all these terms in context?
Sure. I think where I see developers and businesses struggle with the progressive web app concept is differentiating PWAs as a pattern rather than a technology. There are technologies that are part of the PWA pattern, things like a service worker, for example, but there is no sort of single PWA technology. And I think that's usually a big point of confusion. And there are many ways to build a progressive web app. So when I think about like what's the difference between, say, a web app versus a PWA, well, a web app is anything that's built using web technologies that has sort of app-like characteristics. And I think we can, you can probably have a slightly fuzzy definition of exactly what falls into that bucket, but there's probably some some state involved in something that is a web app. So then we take the next step. What is the PWA pattern? The PWA pattern is about the performance, sort of support for offline functionality, the ability to progressively enhance to the feature set of the user agent, such that you're taking advantage of all the features that are available and offering the best possible experience for the user. And although PWAs from like an installability perspective arrived first in the mobile world, they're now installable pretty much everywhere. Now, when I think about single page app versus multi-page app patterns, again, these are really orthogonal to PWA. You can build a progressive web app that is a single page app. That's a very common, we commonly see these things together, but they don't have to be. You can build a great PWA using multi-page architecture. So these are all really kind of on a different axes from one another. And to be honest, I would love to see a single infographic that laid them all out in one place. I'm sure that such a thing is possible. Maybe for a more creative mind than mine or more visual mind than mine could could help put that all together. But yeah, so you could imagine sort of a PWA sitting on top and like, SPA or MPA as ways to getting there. And progressive web apps as being kind of a subset of the set of web apps that have certain characteristics, like their ability to work offline.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to think of, and correct me if I've got the wrong sort of point of view here, but like progressive web app is, as you say, it's more like, hey, it can run online, it can be installable, it's got these characteristics in particular, and then SPA, a single page app, is where the whole, you go to a URL, it downloads the whole lump of JavaScript, and then it will just do very smooth page transitions after you've got the first lump of JavaScript. But you have to wait for potentially a larger download to occur. Whereas a multi-page app is where instead of putting the whole site on a single lump of JavaScript, they might have several URLs and you might go through several transitions like that. And so it may be a mix of smooth transitions and complete page reloads as you jump from area to area. Is that a correct sort of characterization?
It is, yeah. And each of these architectures, have different trade-offs. I think another common question we get is, well, what's better? And the answer is that it depends. And there are even, kind of inside of it depends, there are good and bad ways to implement a single page architecture versus a multi-page architecture. So, for example, you described in a single page architecture, loading more of the application shell up front. And yes, that is something you commonly need to do, but you also don't want to make it too lumpy because that can impact the time of the first page load. So there's a lot of complexity inside of each one of these things, but I think your characterization is accurate.
Phew. Relief. Cool. So if you went to thinking about, because we talk about e-commerce sites, websites in particular here, what would be the main benefits or some of the benefits you can think of for progressive web apps for e-commerce in particular?
So PWA is about a set of heuristics that are commonly associated with a good experience. And, as with any heuristics, it would be possible for you to, implement something that fulfills all of the heuristics and still end up with a bad experience. But what this is intended to do, though, is to, kind of provide a more well-lit path that is more likely to end in success. So when we look at, what are the characteristics of a progressive web app? So things like, taking advantage of the device's capabilities, things like geolocation, push notifications, if it's appropriate, things like WebGL or WebVR. These are going to enhance the quality of the user experience. Things like, working offline, users not encountering the Chrome dyno because they went into, a concrete building. These are just enhancements to the user experiences. So the benefits to e-commerce sites is that, typically, and especially on mobile, but even on desktop, you have some sort of transactional window with the buyer. And, the size of that window is going to depend on the buying intent of that person. So if that person, has, it's a high consideration decision, they've been looking at, 10 different cars and they're ready to spend $50,000 on your car, then that user is probably going to put up with a fair bit of friction. You may still not want to give that user friction, but they may still put up with a fair bit of friction to get that transaction done. But let's say that you have a lower intent purchase happening. It's something that's with not so much consideration. You may actually only have a 20 or 30 second window to capture that customer. And if they are unable to complete their task in the allotted time, they're going to move on. So implementing the PWA pattern is really just about reducing the friction so that you can widen your funnel, lose fewer people through each step, and get more users across the finish line.
Okay, cool. Some of the ones that I've seen, like I remember in talking to some merchants, and you talked about PWA and the concepts of these smoother transitions between pages and so forth, and people would sort of glaze over and say, yeah, everything's better. And then I remember showing them an app, and it's sort of like the light goes on, because it really is that experiential side of things that quite often it makes a difference. Is, it's probably more of the SPA aspect and using that sort of pattern, but if you can go from page to page to page without the whole screen going blank and you wait for the new one to appear and then the smoother you can get that flow, it really is quite amazing the difference in user experience, and like it is just a lot more engaging. And if you can get to each transition, I know Google sometimes puts a little bit of focus on the first transition from search to the merchant's website because, well, that's our job. We're trying to get people, shoppers to people's websites. But it's also important after you arrive there for all the subsequent transitions to have a good experience to retain that customer for an e-commerce site. And so the smoother you can get that experience and the less latency, the more reliability, you don't want to lose someone if they've finally got them to the site because there's one network drop and the page goes away. Yeah, Weekly Names has dropped into the chat. I'll bring this one up. We might come to this one in a moment. But thanks for the comment. It was sort of like, hey, it'd be really helpful to see some live examples of screenshots of a PWA. That might be a little bit tricky because we need to actually get approval for people, like because this is a Google show. I don't want to be just putting up other people's sites without getting prior permission. So we might try and dig it up and put some comments in, but we might have to do that later after we get permissions. So sorry, it's a good idea. Should have thought of that beforehand. Sorry about that. Cool.
There's a directory site like pwa-directory.hotspot.com where you could go and see a good list of live PWAs that you can take a look at.
Okay, I'll might try and dig that one up in a moment. Sorry, could you repeat that URL a little bit slower?
pwa-directory.appspot.com.
This is just doing it live. Nothing like doing something live. Okay, and I'm just going to see if I can share the right screen. These technologies, I want to share that window. Okay, let's go full screen. So this is...
this is not commerce specific. So there's a variety of apps in here, but there may be ways to filter it down to commerce sites.
Yeah, I'm going to do that later. I shouldn't try and do this one particularly live. But okay, so pwa-directory.appspot.com, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yep, I'll try and get that one dropped in. But I managed to close the window instead of maximizing it, so always fun. And thank you for that. So there's a link in the chat sessions. Sure. There was a couple of questions from Twitter, and then I'm going to bring up the one from chat that just came up. Oh, well, actually, I'll bring up the one from chat first, because you're here. We had a question, can you give some best practices on PWA for e-commerce and SEO? So, which is an important aspect to actually find the site.
Yeah. So I think here we come back to PWA versus SPA and MPA as really different things. There isn't that much that's PWA specific about SEO. Whereas the multi-page architecture versus single-page architecture does bring up quite a few SEO-related things. So I think maybe I will answer the question focusing a little bit more on single-page architecture versus multi-page architecture. So first and foremost, URLs are still important, even single-page architecture. So even though you might be moving between views, once the user has kicked off the single-page app, you're going to be wanting to use push state so that the URL that the user sees is updated. And if they were to share that URL, you would want that user, like the user who received the share, to end up kind of in exactly the same page that the user who's sharing is seeing. And so it's important that you preserve a URL structure, that you're following the guidelines or the best practices for URL structures from sort of Google's SEO recommendations, and that each of those pages has metadata, and you're probably going to want to generate each of those pages statically server side. There's really great news on the SEO front, which is that Google announced last year that there was that the crawler is now Evergreen Chrome. So it's no longer an older version of Chrome, which means that it's better at evaluating JavaScript. But there's still advantages to server-side rendering and providing those server-side renders to the crawler, just in terms of the time it takes to index. So you want to make sure that your URL structure still continues to work, even though you're a single page app. You want to make sure that you're still setting, all the relevant metadata at each of those URLs. I think those are kind of the most important things. I've seen some pretty good docs that give a more in-depth breakdown of all the considerations you'd want to think about for single page architecture and SEO, and we could see as a follow-up to this whether we could share a link out to one of those docs, because I've seen quite complete work on this in the past.
Cool, thank you. There was some, I'm trying to get that off the screen. There were some other questions that we got before the call. One was on LinkedIn, which was an interesting sort of question. And I'll get your answer on it, and then I'll see what my one is. But what's the tech stack you'd recommend for an e-commerce store of the future, leveraging Google technology?
So I assume that by tech stack you mean sort of what e-commerce platform, or I'm trying to decide if that's like a front end question or a back end question. I think I would be quite agnostic. I mean, I think you need to look at what it is. What is your team familiar with, and choose a set of technologies that are going to meet the criteria. Are you looking to serve 100 million users or 1 million users? That's definitely you're going to choose different technologies based on a lot of these questions. But in terms of what you should look at, I think you should be looking at technologies that are headless where possible, because then you have this flexibility through the abstraction layer of powering pretty much any front end technology. So let's actually talk a moment about what headless means. Headless means that the e-commerce platform is really just a set of APIs for content and transactions, and that and the nice thing about a headless setup is that even though that platform is providing headless may also provide a front end for it, is that you could like rip and replace that front end at some point in the future if you decide that you want to go in a different direction, or there's a new set of front end technologies that you think is going to better serve your users or your business needs. I think in the past, a lot of the e-commerce systems were quite monolithic, and there was a tight coupling between the front ends and the back ends. And I think that this led to it being quite complex to be creative and to support new interfaces. So like even let's look at the jump from desktop to mobile. Like it was quite challenging. It took a number of years for a lot of commerce systems to do a good job of supporting mobile. The nice thing about moving to headless is that no matter where we go in the future, if we see a big rise in the popularity of buying on TVs through TV web browsers, if we see a big growth in shopping behavior in car screens, the headless architecture is ready to support that, because you could write bespoke front ends, or you can use the web and responsive to write a high quality front end that works on all of these screens, and that's quite independent of your commerce system in the back end.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one thing I'd just add on the headless one is quite frequently a headless platform may still have its own admin UI for doing all the back end operations. It's more the storefront that I think that when most people talk about headless commerce, they're really talking about being able to replace the storefront. And like there's little like pop-up kiosks, or you want to do something in your store and you want to hook it to the same product catalog, and you want to hook it to make sure it's got the same pricing information, and you can build these little custom little experiences with good APIs. And so it's sort of like headless is sort of like it's one of these names, it's a concept, but what does it really mean at the end of the day? Hey, you got APIs. Wow, that's really radical new sort of concept. And so it's sort of like one of these old concepts is new again in some ways, but it's just I agree, like the ability to build custom applications and custom experiences, I agree with. My sort of interesting one on that question as well was like it ended up with leveraging Google technology, and it's sort of like, well, hang on a second. To me, a progressive web app is actually just doing good practices for a web application, and there's some modern technologies that are good to adopt. It's nothing to do with Google, these are actually just generic web technologies that we promote to help the web. And so I don't actually have a recommendation based on Google technology. I almost think, well, the whole idea is these are web technologies. If it was Google specific, I'm not sure I'd be recommending it in quite the same way. I don't recommend an e-commerce site only work on Chrome. But the progressive part is where you can detect if a browser supports such a feature, and if so, adapt it on your site. And if it's not available, well, it should still cope without it. We had another question. This might fall into the other one, but I'll ask it anyway. PJ, what's your favorite PWA site? Is there a particular one that you love?
Oh, I thought, are we allowed to name names of sites here?
I guess as long as we say this is not a Google recommendation and this is just a personal sort of like, yeah, why not?
One I use every day is Twitter Lite. It's fantastic. Now, if we want to get into commerce, one that I've been super impressed with is Myntra, myntra.com. Fantastic PWA. There's a lot of commerce PWAs out there now in EMEA. That would be like Atam would be another great example of a fantastic PWA in commerce. They're really all over the place now. What I do see a lot of teams struggling with is the performance score. So a lot of teams are having more success with meeting the PWA criteria, but the performance criteria is still like an ongoing struggle. And I think we all know the reasons for that. It's the combination of back end and front end struggles and the the need for a lot of marketing tech that can slow down the user experience, but is necessary for commerce, for understanding affiliate and understanding user behavior, etc.
It's almost like a good PWA. You shouldn't need to know it's a PWA. It's just a good website. It's got a pleasing experience when you're on the website. But how would you, if it was if you go to a lot of sites may already be PWAs that people are using, how would they detect if a site is a PWA? What's the easiest way?
So, from a user's perspective, they don't have any developer tools installed. Then the easiest way for them to see that it's a PWA would be if they're fulfilling the PWA criteria, then they will get an install event. And so on mobile, that manifests as a info bar that appears on the bottom of the experience that says "Add to Home Screen." On desktop, there's this in the Omni box on the top right side, you'll see this little kind of circle with a plus in the middle, and it animates when you first land on the site and says "install" for a moment, and then the words auto hide, and it just leaves the icon behind. If you're a developer, then Lighthouse is the easiest way to see how you're doing with respect to fulfilling the PWA criteria. So I don't know, is it worth a moment to segue on to discuss Lighthouse?
If you want to.
Sure. Lighthouse is a set of developer tools to help developers build better web experiences. It does help with PWA specifically, but it provides a variety of other tools as well to help with performance, accessibility, etc. So you could think of it almost as a scorecard for your site that also has helpful tips for how to improve the score. So it's a good way to evaluate where you're at with your front end and to kind of prioritize where you should be investing. That's most likely to have payoffs for your site in the speed of your customer's experience and the quality of your customer's experience.
One thing I probably should insert is we had an episode a few weeks back where we did a live review of a site using Lighthouse. So we have had an episode going deep onto Lighthouse, which I forgot to mention to you. Mm-hmm. But I think like Lighthouse going into like the developer tools under the audits tab and just doing an audit of a site can tell you, because you might find that more sites are actually PWA than you realize. There's been a few more questions in the chat. I might bring up some of them. So one question was, oops, I was hoping I could bring up multiple messages at once. But as we all know about PWA, everything looks green. So when one should not think about going to PWA. Okay, sorry, I'll go to the second one, which is getting into just the wording was a little bit confusing to me. Sorry. What are the cons of going to PWA? It's a nice, concise way of putting it, I think. When should you not do a PWA site?
Since PWAs are just a pattern for building a good web experience, it's pretty hard to come up with reasons why you wouldn't implement a PWA. The degree to which you need to support offline varies, but I would say that every site should have some kind of branded offline experience, even if it is simply as a splash saying, sorry, you need a connection for this to work. Maybe a one-page marketing microsite, potentially. Like if you don't think the user's ever going to come back there, there's a tiny bit of overhead involved in setting up and installing the service worker, but it really is quite small. So if there's even a chance the user might come back there, it's probably still worth getting that service worker in. So I would have a tough time saying when should you not use PWA as a pattern. I think if this question is more about single page architecture versus multi-page architecture, then that's a much more complex discussion.
I think another thing that can come up sometimes is if you're on an e-commerce platform and the platform doesn't give you enough controls, you may be limited by the platform. So sometimes you might not be able to turn it into, like, if you can't change the head, if you can't add new scripts to the page, you may not be able to install a service worker. So it may be more a matter of, I'd probably say it's things like, well, does the platform limit you so much that the benefits of doing it isn't going to be worth the pain and anguish of trying to get it to work? Like, am I going to throw out the complete storefront and stack of the platform just to add installability? Well, that may not be cost effective. But otherwise, yeah, a PWA is just website. It's a one that's designed better and it's got better characteristics. And yeah, like losing someone just because the network dropped is such a pain. But just having that single page, it just brings up saying, I'm sorry, the network was lost, click here and we'll take you back to the home page. And hopefully you've retained their shopping cart, is a much better experience and do a branded experience. And it's pretty easy to do. So yeah, I think that's a good piece of advice, that one. Got another question from the chat. Thank you for all these questions. These are great. We've got my own questions. I think these ones are better. So what are the challenges of migrating to a PWA? Is it a no-brainer or does it require a lot of planning?
A lot of my answers here are always going to be it depends. It depends. And let me walk you through some of the factors there. So adding, like some parts of adding, PWAifying a website are pretty straightforward. So if you just creating and adding a manifest, this you should be able to do this quite independent of anything else that's going on in your site. It's not going to be much work. Adding a minimal service worker, using something like Workbox and just like handling a single like offline event and redirecting the user to a splash screen saying, service is unavailable while you're offline. Again, this is pretty straightforward. It should be, hours, not weeks of work to fulfill this criteria. So for a lot of the, kind of the basic stuff of making a PWA, this is something that it shouldn't take teams too long, and it is quite possible to work incrementally from, kind of an existing single or multi-page architecture site to fulfilling a full badge PWA. Now, then there's stuff that is more complicated. Like if you are talking about migrating from multi-page to single-page architecture, which sometimes makes sense, but not always, then that can be quite a lot of work, because that's really a rethink of some very fundamental aspects of the site. Like you're going to be creating an application shell, and you're going to be mapping your content into different views inside of this application shell. That can be quite a lot of work, and there's still ways to go about doing that incrementally. Like you could just do it for certain journeys, for example. Like you could say, land on product listing page to product detail page to cart. That could be one journey, and you focus on turning that into a single page app, and then it's like sort of slowly mapping more and more parts of the journey, or the checkout flow, for example. That can be quite a challenge for teams. So I've certainly seen the migrating from multi-page architecture to single-page architecture be something that could take teams, weeks or months to accomplish. But actually, just like kind of, defining the manifest, having basic offline functionality, and the other core criteria being a PWA, this is relatively straightforward.
Yeah, and so if I get your answer correctly, if you've got an existing e-commerce site and it's got an existing set of technology in the way they normally do front ends, the first stage would probably just work out if you can add the PWA criteria to that existing storefront. Moving, for example, from like a lot of e-commerce platforms are PHP based, and you go page to page and it does a full page reload on each page. It's a multi-page application. And you can add PWA to such a site as long as you've got the ability to add in a service worker and add some of these cover capabilities in a manifest file. And it's not really that onerous. And so getting to a PWA is fairly straightforward. It's if you're redesigning the whole thing as a React application and you've got to throw out your whole code base of your whole storefront, well, obviously that's where it becomes a bigger effort. But that's not required to make a PWA. That's a separate decision that you want to make this more engaging experience. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree.
Okay, cool. Thank you. There was another question that actually came up before from Twitter, which was, is PWA viable for SMB merchants, so for smaller merchants?
I would say absolutely yes. And what you'll be looking for to make that easier will be e-commerce platforms and themes on those platforms that are giving you kind of getting you 90% of the way there. So I know that that's possible on a number of popular SME platforms. So you just want to check with your e-commerce platform provider and see whether or not they have kind of PWA starter themes. It should be possible with most of them today. I'm sure that there are some that maybe aren't all the way there yet because, as Alan mentioned earlier, things like service worker or manifest files, they need to live somewhere in the file system. If you have no ability in your platform to create those, then that can be a blocker. But I think most of the platforms that I can think of offhand, this functionality is fully supported.
Cool. Another question from the chat. Keep them coming. These are great. I think we might have partly answered this one, but just get it clear. Is there a PWA audit tool similar to Google's PageSpeed Insights?
Yeah, Lighthouse is really the one that I'd recommend.
Yeah, and so Lighthouse is built into Chrome. If you go to Chrome, Developer Tools, Audits, it's the Audits tab inside. So that it's not actually called Lighthouse. It is Lighthouse, but yeah, cool.
If you can also go to webpagetest.org/easy, right? I think that's the right path. Webpagetest.org/easy, and then at the bottom there's just a few boxes there, and the bottom box is Run Lighthouse Audit. Just put a checkbox in there, and you can punch in any URL you want, and anyone can do this, even if they're not using Chrome. And you get a nice report that's shareable, within your org.
Cool. The next one I might answer, and then you can add to it for a change. Can we recommend a PWA plugin for WordPress? Well, this one I know a fair bit about because some other people in our team have been working on it, which is the site kit for WordPress, which is actually from Google, has been putting a number of extensions like capabilities into WordPress, and we've been working deeply with the WordPress ecosystem to get PWA support built into the core. And so the one I'd be recommending is there's one from Google in this area. It's not explicitly a PWA. There's more work going on because you've got to make sure that everybody plays together. For example, a site can only have one service worker. And so we've been working with the core team to sort of put the infrastructure in place so that all the extensions that want to contribute to the service worker can, even though there's only one on the site. So I know that one actually Google's been doing a fair bit of work on. Did you want to add anything to that one, PJ?
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah, so it's called SiteKit, SITEKIT, as for WordPress. So it'd be definitely the one I'd recommend, especially being from Google, completely unbiased. But no, that one we've been working very closely with the WordPress team because WordPress is such a large portion of the market. We have another question. Is there some code repository of service workers for testing?
Code repository of service workers for testing. I'm not sure exactly what they're looking for.
Yeah. So if you can add any more question on the chat, I'll come back to that one question in a moment. So if you could just expand on that question, happy to answer it. Not exactly sure what it means. Like, are you meaning a repository of service workers to test your own code, or is it to make testing of service workers easier, and so forth? If you just expand on that one, it'd be great.
One pointer that I would make for anyone who's looking to implement service workers for the first time would be towards Workbox. Mm-hmm. This is a set of JavaScript libraries for implementing service worker and adding offline support to web apps. It can really simplify the process for a lot of teams. So yeah, just do a search on Workbox and you'll find it. Cool.
Well, I might go back to some other questions that are coming up shortly, but I might ask one of my ones just while they finish typing those questions there. Is a PWA as good as a native app? How would you do the pros and cons of building like a native mobile app versus a PWA site?
I think I would expand this question to be more like web platform versus native apps as opposed to PWA specifically, because PWAs are not don't specify, for example, WebXR or any other sort of features or capabilities that would be stacked up specifically around native. And I think with web platform versus native, the answer is going to be it depends. But for many use cases, the web platform is equally capable. Let's take commerce generally. The web platform has some very nice advantages with respect to the fact that the experience is streaming. So, for example, when the user first lands on your page, they don't actually have to kind of go through this process of downloading software, which can add a lot of upfront time to getting to an interactive experience. That they land on the page, everything loads. They can choose products and purchase directly. So there's not a lot in the experience that you can, or anything really that I can think of that would be critical to a shopping journey that you can't do on the web. There may be specific capability areas, and this is something where you need to evaluate your use cases and just look at what is the web, what can the web do today versus what it is that I need. But these are getting to be more and more unusual with software packages like AutoCAD running on the web. It's pretty clear that the web can do a lot of different things, including a lot of things that people from a few years ago would have been surprised to discover. That is a web that is now a web capability. So I know I'm answering a lot of these questions with it depends, but really I would look at it from the perspective of the web's where you're going to get the reach and cross-platform support. So look to see can I do what I need to do with the web technology, and then try to understand like what are there needs that I can't accomplish with web technology, and how am I going to accomplish those. And that could be one example of ways you could accomplish that would be, okay, well I need a native app, but most of that experience can be shared with my with my web app, and then I just kind of need a little bit of a few native views inside of this app to add this extra functionality. And then you're maximizing your return on investment because you have one code base for the majority of the experience, and you just have a small bespoke experience off to one side for your that one use case you need to support.
Cool. We had a question from the chat, which I'll just bring up. I'm looking for ways of getting started with PWAs. What's the best path? Is there a place where I can tinker with existing code without breaking, it says licenses, but I'd say with breaking things in general?
So I would suggest starting on web.dev. There's a progressive web app section in there that will walk you through all the essential ingredients of building a progressive web app, from creating your manifest through to how to promote the installable experience from your PWA. I think there's also, there is also some code labs in there that you can download, and that's a good place to, kind of get started with a code base you can tinker with that will work for you more or less out of the box.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I don't know if it's still an issue, but I remember early on one of the things you needed to be careful for is service workers would install themselves, and then you'd make some changes to the source code, and you didn't realize it was still using the old service worker, because the whole idea of a service worker is to cache. Is there any particular things to watch for in that area when trying to play with the service workers to make sure that you get the most recent code?
So with when you're in development, I think I'm just gonna have a quick look at this code lab and see how it supports that. But I think with your development environment, for sure, if you're just not setting expiry headers on stuff, then when you force refresh, it's going to check for updates of that code, and it should refresh it. So that concern doesn't come up too often. When you're in production, we do get a fair bit of concern around the service worker refresh rate. So that's something that you might want to watch out for is the length of the cache time that you set on your service worker in production.
Mm-hmm. And it's probably true of actually many other resources in production as well. It's a common problem. How long do you set the cache time? And if you've got multiple assets and they all need to work together for the site to work, but you've got a cache time that's a long cache time, I know it's a constant sort of problem we hit in other sites as well. Cool. If you're designing a PWA, are there any different UX flows that you think you'd be thinking about? Or what other UX issues come up with the installability, the offline access? What other considerations that you might not have thought about on a normal site can you think of?
So something PWAs, although you don't have to reconsider a lot of your UX to implement a PWA. I would look at PWAs as an opportunity, though, to reconsider a lot of your UX and think about the patterns of modern computing experiences. And in particular, if you're using a PWA to support your mobile users, then you want to think about what the interactive patterns are that are more common on mobile devices, and use this moment of updating to make your web app PWA to implement a lot of those patterns. So what are these common patterns? Like touch friendliness, large touch targets that are far enough apart from each other that users are not going to have trouble interacting with them. In some cases, infinite scroll is something that users are used to with respect to kind of feed-like content. In other cases, you may actually want screens that don't scroll, because in native apps, a pattern that comes up fairly often is kind of a fixed view where you move horizontally instead of vertically. There's a lot of different patterns there, and more than enough to fill up an entire talk. So what I would suggest is actually there's a pointer to some discussion talks that have been given at Chrome Dev Summit and in other places where we've gone into more detail about different UX patterns that we recommend for modern web applications. And again, I just kind of want to call out that these are really orthogonal to PWAs in general. You can have a PWA that still has a very kind of old-fashioned web style user experience. We just recommend that you use the update to a PWA as an opportunity to implement more modern patterns that will be more familiar to users on touchscreen devices.
Mm-hmm. There was, I should contact that one. There was one message I've missed in the chat session, but my software truncated it, so I'll jump off to the main site and have a look in a moment. So apologies for that one. Going a little bit further, in terms of network outages, and like the resilience to network. Is there any design patterns you can think of? And I might jump back on with a couple I know of if you don't cover them. But like with the network resilience and caching and service worker, can you think of anything that you should consider in particular for service PWA and so forth? So, for example, well, I'll kick it off, and then you might add some other ones. So I'm not trying to ask a leading question here, but for example, one of the concerns is if you cache content and you've got a service worker and it's returning caching information, you get into issues like, oh, if it's a cached pricing information, or if it's cached stock level information, and the site is getting updated. In some countries, there are legal issues. Like if it's just caching it for a few seconds, it doesn't really matter. It's going to be just the same as on a real site. But if you're caching it across days and you're trying to keep information cached in the browser, and so pricing information has changed, or there's a sale on. Now, in some jurisdictions, you can get yourself in legal hot water to sort of say, well, on the product page it said the price was X, but when I went to checkout, the price was Y. That comes across as, and it's problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's bad user experience, if nothing else, because who wants to be sort of felt like they're being misled? Can you think of any other sorts of issues like that can come up with caching? And that's the main one I've come across, is sort of like having the cached information and it goes stale, and then how do you represent that in the UX? Like if you're offline, should you show the price, or should you just say, sorry, I'm offline, and don't show the cached price? Have you hit any similar sorts of problems with PWAs in your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one to tackle, and I guess I would advise teams to think about like, how would you solve this generally, not just in the web context? Like, how do you solve it in your app context as well? And there's a few different ways to do this. Like if you are, you could have an event loop running that periodically revalidates. Like, I mean, how do you handle this even if you don't have a service worker at all? If the user opened the page and kind of went away for a week, turned their device off, went on vacation, and came back, turned it on, do you handle that case? So I'll look at how you solve it generally. And then with the service worker, one of the workbox strategies that's enabled there is something called stale well revalidate, which is a good pattern to use because it gets something in front of the user very quickly, and then it double checks that the information is actually fresh and correct, and substitutes fresh information for stale information if there has been a change. Cool.
Oh, and oh no, I missed the chance of bringing up a chat comment, because the next chat comment was he'd typed in what I was doing was actually asking about exactly the same thing, which was caching of pricing. So thank you on that one. If you're going to try and evaluate, so there's a number of PWA products on the market already, and I'm sort of in two minds about listing some of the ones I know of, because I'm not actually recommending any of them with my Google hat on. But how would you go about evaluating? If you go off and do a Google search, you'll find a number of different offerings out there for different e-commerce platforms. How would you go off and evaluate and sort of choose between them, do you think?
Yeah, I think about like what are the dimensions that you want to measure them on. So I would look at performance, both like, what is the performance score of like their demo site or the scaffold that they're going to give you to start from. But then also like go out and look at like what is the performance of some of their top users, and like that'll just give you an indication of like, is it possible to achieve good performance scores with this platform? There are some platforms that make it quite difficult, maybe because they give you limited customization over what third-party scripts run, or just their time to first byte is slower than what you'd like. So look at it from the performance perspective. Look at it from the customization perspective. There's always trade-offs between ease of use and power, and so you're going to want to understand like what are your needs, and is it okay that something's a little more cookie cutter, but you can get it done more quickly, and is that going to be a limit on your growth in the future, or is that an acceptable trade-off for you? You might also want to look at how many successful PWAs have been built on this platform, because that could give you some indicators that maybe there are surprising gotchas in the process. Those are some of the criteria that I would look at when evaluating a platform.
Yeah. There was a question, and this is one I don't think we can necessarily answer being a Google sort of channel, is can we recommend good PWA frameworks in the market which support multiple e-commerce frameworks? And as Google unfortunately recommend, no, can't do that one. If you do some Google searches, you'll find some of them. I'd be doing things like, go to the GitHub repository, look at how many stars it's got, how often is a commit, how many contributors are there, and so forth, and just look at the vibrancy of the audience. It's just how you evaluate anything else. The fact that it's PWA is almost irrelevant. It's just how do you evaluate any software, frankly. It's just a matter of saying we think that PWA is a worthwhile thing for these products to also incorporate. So it's a sort of like a non-answer. Sorry about that one, but something a bit hard to answer. This might actually be a follow-on to the previous one. It's talking about a knowledge base of particular PWA frameworks. Are they good? You mentioned one directory before. Are there any other directories you know of, PWAs or best practices or any other information?
Yeah, so there's another PWA directory I know of is called AppScope. That's appsco.pe. What are other good PWA resources? So of course, there's plenty of information, like reference documentation on MDN for every aspect of what you need to know to build a PWA. So if you're looking for in-depth technical details on, say, a manifest, etc., MDN is your go-to source. We've talked a little bit about web.dev, which is focusing more on guides and tutorials. I think of other PWA doc sites that I would recommend.
What about in the user experience sort of area? It almost feels like it's almost like a gap because not enough people have done it yet to actually. If you do something once, well, hey, great. But sometimes it's like best practices to me. You need a large volume of people doing it, and for service workers, if I pick the individual technologies, I think people are coming up with techniques for those individual ones. But I don't know. I've seen some people use PWA and offline and caching with service worker, and it almost feels to me like there's two levels of commitment. Level number one is I'm going to get my site to be PWA compatible, and I'm going to have some offline caching, and if a network drops, I'll take you to a nice friendly homepage. And then you can take the extra step, and the extra step is my site you can add to cart while you're offline. I'm going to cache a whole lot of catalog information in the app and download it proactively and actually have it stored in the browser so that I can navigate around the site a lot more without having a network connection. And then maybe you only need to be connected when you actually do the checkout flow then. So you can actually do a lot more offline. And the question is when you've got to build that app, there's not many frameworks that I know that support that out of the box. That may be incorrect, there may be some, but then is it worth the cost of developing it is more the question. It's not whether it's possible or not. It's just sort of like, well, if I've got to build all of that site up, I think for the majority and the most cost effective, and feel free to disagree if you want, this is purely subjective opinion, but it feels like making the site resilient to a temporary network loss, for me, feels more bang for the buck. I get network drops all the time. I'm here in Silicon Valley, and you sort of say, oh, the network's perfect, you don't have to worry about it. It's just not true. You go into a lift. Around the house, the kids saturate the Wi-Fi with all the YouTube they're watching at the moment. There's all these other things that just go wrong at times. Just having that little bit of resilience seems to be like a big benefit. The other ones, I just wonder how much it's worth. I'm not saying it's not worth doing, but I think you've got to think about your own user base. Like if I'm in India with a lower, well, even India, the network coverage has got a lot better. But if I'm in Africa and I've got much more sporadic network connections, then it would become to me a lot more important to put a lot more investment into the service worker and offline capabilities. And so it really depends upon your needs, your user base, your scenario. I don't think there's a single generic answer for these sorts of questions.
I agree that a generic answer is hard to come by. This is where I usually recommend, kind of this like have heroes. So like find some hero sites and then like ask yourself, what makes this a hero site? What's amazing about the experience that I get on this site? And it could be a site that's in your vertical. So it could be a competitor, but it might also just be some other experience that you're having on the web. And if there's a moment when you're browsing and you're like, wow, this is great. I didn't know you could do this with the web. That's probably a good moment to have a look and see what are they doing, what's different about this experience than others, what makes it more seamless, and what are the techniques that I could apply to my own experience. A couple of free ebooks on this that we could share URLs to. So there was an intro to PWA with a practical side ebook that was published in 2018, but is still the content's still quite fresh. Includes UX guidance, and then there's a volume 2 of that came out quite recently that talks a lot about web superpowers and trade-offs between web and native. And we can share links to that on Twitter following this.
Cool. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up one last question from the chat feed, and then you can have any closing comments. But the last question then, since much of the technology around PWA is based on newer technologies, do you have any advice for future-proofing?
So I guess it is a question about ensuring that the experience is ready for the next generation of devices, or ensuring
I think that it may also be just simply, if it's a newer technology, it's more likely to change. No, is it stable? Mm-hmm. How do you decide if a technology is stable versus, and like one answer I've got is actually most of the PWA technologies are not new. They're actually quite old. And there are sites like Can I Use? There's actually a website that you can work out which browsers support which technologies. And so I frequently go to that site to sort of decide whether technology X. But I guess the other aspect of it to me is like the progressive side is you can frequently write your application so that if it's supported, use it, and if it's not supported, still keep working, because there's some people are on older generation phones. And so you can actually make, that's to me part of the progressive aspect of it, is to say, if your browser has got the better capabilities, use them. If not, back off and still give an experience that works. And to me, that's the whole progressive concept on it. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I could completely agree. Like, manifests are years old. Service workers as well. Almost, and it's, if an API lands in the web platform, it's been through a pretty thorough shakedown. It's not impossible for web APIs to change, but they change rarely. So if it's something as part of the platform, do check Can I Use to look at the cross-platform or the cross-browser support for that particular feature. But most of the ones that I would imagine would be commonly used in the e-commerce experience are going to be supported across every major browser on the majority of devices, and have probably been a part of the platform for more than a year. And in some cases, more than 5 years or more than 10 years.
Yeah, I'm just going to drop a link in myself on this one. For example, there was a new lazy loading attribute, or relatively new, and it was a question of, well, can we use it yet? It speeds up image display, makes it very easy to do lazy loading of images, and so the Can I Use is a really good site to sort of work out, well, what breadth of browsers is it supported in, to work out, is it worth doing? The lazy attribute I quite like, because you can stick it in if the browser doesn't understand it. Well, it won't lazy load. But if the majority of browsers support it, well, it may be worthwhile. But we're at the end of time. Thank you very much, PJ. Is there any closing comments that you wanted to add?
I guess I would just say, please explore the space. Leave feedback for me on Twitter if you want. Alan, are you able to share my Twitter handle with everyone?
Yep, I will do that again.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're looking to hear from you. Where are you having, where you're struggling? What are your success stories of getting PWAs and traction with your users and inside of your organization? And what's missing? if you're running into some, a difficulty where you're like, oh, I really wish that I could do this, and you find that you can't, I would love to hear about that.
Yep. I was actually quite amused by your Twitter handle, by the way. So I will paste it into the comments in a moment, but it's basically bit rot, but instead of an I and an O, it's a 1 and a 0. It was a very nerdy sort of thing, but I loved it. So I'll drop your Twitter handle in the chat. But otherwise, thank you very much for spending the time, and thank you very much for all who's joined and left comments. If you're watching the video afterwards, still appreciate if you enjoyed the episode, the like button. Each week in the discussion session, we have we put up a thread for the upcoming episodes, and if you've got any questions in advance, feel free to reply to that thread and put a comment onto that, and we'll make sure to get that covered. But thank you all for attending. Take care.